My name is Dr. Ruth Allan, and this is my podcast, Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. Our world has become a minefield for our children to get the best out of their brain and whole body health, which is why I founded the Wellbeing Warrior Academy to help them navigate this minefield effectively. Right now, if you go to www.wellbeingwarrioracademy.com and use the code podcast10, you can get 10% off all programs. That's www.wellbeingwarrioracademy.com and use the code podcast10 at checkout. Now, let's get back to this week's episode of Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain.
Welcome to the show, Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. I am really looking forward to this conversation with my friend Jon Paul de Lange. Welcome to the show, JP.
Ruth, so great to be here with you. Hi.
And I know we were just talking before we went on live to realise that we've known each other for just over 20 years.
Unbelievable.
I know.
Unbelievable.
It doesn't feel like that long, does it?
It sure doesn't. No, we've been busy since then, though, haven't we?
We have been a bit busy.
Yeah.
And you thankfully, because my memory's not as good, reminded me that we actually met in London. I thought it was the States, but we actually met in London at a defence conference in London shortly after 9/11. And my goodness, what a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then.
Unbelievable, the amount of developments that have taken place since then, and it's been so gratifying to keep in touch over the years, and what a surprise to be here together.
I know, it's obviously meant to be, wasn't it? For us staying in touch.
What a gift.
So for those that don't know, Jon Paul, or JP as he likes to be known, he is a US Army veteran with 30 years on active duty, totaling more than 24 deployments. And I'm sure it's a lot more since we first met. I don't know how many you've been on actually since we first met, but he discovered he had service-connected PTSD on his own 11 years after he retired. And he's combined his experience to develop his own coaching practice for veterans and their families, which I think is so, so important. And his goal is to raise awareness of the presence of traumatic stress across our society and to dissolve the stigmas around PTSD, or post-traumatic stress, as I like to call it, so that more people are less afraid to get the help that they really need. Wow. And I'd just love to, before we really dive into the conversation of your journey that got you to where you are today, and us talking now, is what are you passionate about in life right now?
Oh my gosh, Ruth, right now, as you just said, I was diagnosed 11 years after I retired. And that started me on a journey that brought me to this point. First, I was very surprised at my diagnosis, but at the same time, being diagnosed led me to some self-discovery that answered so many questions that I've been asking for so much of my life about who am I, what am I meant to be, what's my purpose. But eventually, my self-inquiry became inquiry for other veterans. I wondered, if I didn't get diagnosed for 11 years after I retired, how many others are out there that don't even know that they're living with symptoms of traumatic stress? Wow. I have about a dozen of them, and they show up in their own way. But it happens slowly over time, such that I thought it was a normal part of who I was, until I had an event where that exposed me to the possibility that I was struggling with traumatic stress, and the rest is history. And so I'm very passionate right now about helping other veterans, no matter where they served or what service they served in, or really what nation they're from, that are struggling with traumatic stress, but aren't seeking the treatment to get help, because there's great treatment out there, as you're well aware, that works. and that aren't doing the kinds of things they need to do to level up their life and be extraordinary. Because I'm living proof, I really believe it, that if you take the right steps to do the self-care that's needed and prepare for your future, you can live an extraordinary life, even if you're still living with the symptoms of traumatic stress. So that's what I'm passionate about right now, but particularly for active duty military, that there's so many stigmas, so many fears around the idea of getting diagnosed. I'm going to be isolated. I'm going to be marginalized. I might lose my career. I might lose my my security clearance, and I can't risk that. So better just to pack it in, suppress it, repress it, and live with it so that nobody finds out. Well, that's just a recipe for disaster down the road in terms of our own personal health and well-being. And so I want to try to help people through that process and come out the other side realizing that there was a lot of worry for nothing. I really want to start a national conversation eventually, and just really work on bringing this topic into the light. The more we can do that, I think that the easier it will be to drop some of those stigmas and treat it like the wound that trauma is. Trauma is just a wound, as you know.
Right, exactly. It's an emotional wound and a mental wound, and it may be tied into a physical wound and a spiritual wound, which is, you know, the loss of your sense of identity, or the loss of your sense of purpose or meaning in life. And I think we forget that, don't we? Like you say, that it is a wound, and it deserves the treatment, the appropriate treatment, as soon after as the wound occurred, in order to help it heal properly. And I think so often, whether it's tied into grief, or it's because often grief and trauma come hand in hand, and particularly in the context of losing someone that may happen as a consequence of the experience, or losing many, depending on your actual trauma, is that we need to give ourselves that permission to grieve, and we need to give ourselves that permission to ask for help to heal. Just in the same way that we have, you know, break an arm. We don't like walking around with a broken arm hoping that no one will notice and pretending it doesn't hurt, because it really does. And the longer you leave it broken, the more it hurts. And it's exactly the same from a trauma perspective.
Absolutely. We wouldn't ignore a physical injury if we had one that was bad enough. We know that there's care available, and we think nothing about going to get that care. We need to have the same kind of attitude when we're psychologically wounded, because you hit it on the head, Ruth. It's not just a psychological wound. That science has proven that the mind and the body are one system. And so what affects us psychologically also affects us physically. It affects us emotionally. It affects us spiritually. And it's not just us, you know, many veterans, as you know, that are living with traumatic stress also have families. So the families are affected by this as well. And we've really, really got to work to bring this into the light and help the healing process.
I totally agree. And I'd love to explore, you know, given that you discovered that you had it 11 years after you retired. And obviously when we first met, you were serving in the US military. What was the indicator for you? Because you said that something happened that brought it to your attention that you had potentially post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, purely by accident, Ruth. From about 2003 until 2018, I was solely focused on the counter IED fight. And for those people that don't know what an IED is, it's a roadside bomb. It was the primary weapon against U.S. and coalition forces during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And most of the casualties in that war were suffered at the hands of because of IEDs. And so I immersed myself in that work from very early in the war until just a few years ago, just until my diagnosis. um, and was exposed to tremendous amount of battle damage and outcomes of blasts, and spent a lot of time in theater in Iraq, Kuwait, a little bit in Afghanistan, but in that region, doing test and evaluation of equipment that we fielded to the force that was designed to protect them from these roadside bombs. And it was very intense work, exposed to vehicles that had been ripped to shreds as a result of these bombings. And, you know, those kinds of things just redoubled my commitment to helping these service members survive on the battlefield. Back in DC, where I lived, there was a wall in the organization I worked for called JIDO. Many people are familiar with that organization, the Joint IED Defeat Organization. And on that wall, they posted a picture of soldiers that were killed in the previous week during the war.
Goodness.
And that had an impact on me as well. Every time I walked into the building, there was that wall, and it was growing and it was growing. Fast forward to 2018, I've been retired for 11 years. I was, by this time, a radical forgiveness coach, working on myself, and very much by accident was exposed to a method of treatment called somatic experiencing.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes. And Peter Levine developed somatic experiencing. And there's an old YouTube video of him interviewing a U.S. Marine. And it was the first time I saw it, had no idea what to expect, but that Marine served in Iraq, and he was involved in an IED blast that, while he was in his vehicle, that killed the Marines, the 3 Marines that he was in the vehicle with. He was a sole survivor, and he had a tic that he kept, and he spoke with a stutter.
Yeah, which is common actually to experience tics. Is often a common sign of trauma. Yes.
And so as the story developed, I really identified with this Marine because I knew what he had gone through, having been exposed to it so much. And I had a meltdown. I completely fell apart because of really irrational thoughts that I was having. I could have done more. I should have done more. It's that. It's a little bit of survivor's guilt, I think, that, you know, here I was having a great life, but there were so many that lost their lives on the battlefield, and I wish that I could have done more for them. And so because of my reaction to that, I decided to start looking into getting myself checked out. And so I did, and started in getting somatic experiencing treatment, and it has worked wonders, not only for me personally, but for my marriage as well. You know, my wife and I were struggling a little bit, I'll confess. And we had an argument and noticed we seemed to be arguing about the same thing over and over. So we saw a pattern. And that was another event that kind of motivated me to get into somatic experiencing. So we went together. We found a practitioner that specialized in military members and couples. And we were so blessed to find the practitioner we did. And over the course of about 4 years, it has made a remarkable difference in my life. Of course, I wasn't solely focused on that. As a radical forgiveness coach, I also augmented that with high performance coaching. And I've developed a model whereby I really believe, as you said it in the beginning, we really need to take a whole of body, mind and body approach to dealing with our traumatic stress, whether it be from grief, or whether it be from war, or poverty, or there are so many sources of trauma that we can experience, as a way to treat it and as a way to beat it. Our traumas tend to show up sometimes every day in the form of triggers. And these triggers I teach to my clients and others. It's our body's way of talking to us. So I need
I want to pause you. I love that, because I often say to my clients is that our body shouts because our mind isn't listening. And often
Beautiful.
how we express ourselves physically, if we, the expression often in illness, physical illness, fibromyalgia is an example. Some cancer can be, traced back to unaddressed emotional trauma. And I've had guests on the show around that, that we forget to listen to our body sometimes, don't we? Because it's telling us something. And the more we turn down the volume of what our body's saying, the louder it keeps shouting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, I think I could say this for Western culture in general. We don't deal with our feelings very well. It's like we're very dismissive over a part of who we are. We call it weak to pay attention to our feelings or to express them, or have all sorts of judgments. But this is the language our mind body speaks to us, and we would do well to listen to it. So when I had that meltdown, I thought it was high time to listen.
Well, I'm really pleased you did. And I'd love for you to explain to those that don't know anything about somatosensory experience, somatic experiencing,
yes,
what that is and how it works.
I don't think it's too far off. I think there are similarities between somatic experiencing and havening, which you teach as well, which you have available to folks that visit your website. I would characterize it this way. It's all about really slowing down. We live such fast-paced lives where we seem to multitask with everything that we do. We're paying attention to so much that we're really not focused on one thing. And so somatic experiencing is really about slowing down the pace that you're moving, that you're operating, being observant around what's going on in the space where you are, and reminding yourself, I'm safe, I'm okay, all is well. Sometimes the thoughts that we have that are so intrusive, that trigger us into episodes of irritability or moodiness, or when we lash out to people, that when that happens, this is our body telling us there's a threat out there. It doesn't know if it's real or imagined, but it's as our nervous system's number one job is to keep us safe and keep us alive. So when we perceive a threat, we respond to it. Well, somatic experiencing is about slowing down enough so that you can recognize that when you're applying it, when you're practicing it, you're in a safe space. And then as you're getting comfortable in the space you're in, it's noticing what's happening in your body, what feelings are coming up for you, and then describe them. This is part of the process of slowing down. Let's get into describing them. Where do you feel it specifically? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it sharp? Is it does it have a color? Does it have a shape?
Yeah, we do all of that in havening. So it's probably tying somatic experiencing into havening as well.
Yes.
Is to pay attention to the somatosensory encoding that you have in your body as part of the trauma.
What astonished me about it, Ruth, was how practicing something so simple as that, and being really focused and deliberate on it, how memories would start to pop into my mind, past memories. Often it was to my childhood. I had a tough childhood growing up, and that informed a lot of who I am and who I'm working on, but also military experiences that I had in the military. I was exposed to ethnic cleansing in Kosovo in 1999, lots of starvation and malnutrition and abject poverty in other parts of the world, and of course war. It's a lot of people think, well, only soldiers get PTSD, and only those soldiers that have engaged in direct combat. Well, that's not true at all. That's a stereotype that we really need to get rid of. The thing about trauma, though, and why somatic experiencing worked for me is trauma is not about what happened to us. Trauma is about what's going on inside of us as a result of what happened to us.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's good news in that. That's why I call my diagnosis a gift, because if it's about what's going on inside of me as a result of something that happened, then I can do something about that. If it was about what happened to me, I don't have any control over that, but I do have control over what happens inside of me, and I can do something about that. So I was fired up about somatic experiencing, and look, I'll be honest, it was not always fun.
No, I'm sure it wasn't,
No.
as it often, often isn't when you're having to explore feelings, physical and emotional, that you've kept locked away for a long time.
Yes, but I was always surprised at, number one, the feelings, which I had been accustomed to feeling, but the memories that they were connected to, that started to return to my awareness. This happened so many years ago. It's like your body remembers everything that you have ever experienced, and it stores it. And if you don't process it, I believe a long-term consequence of not paying attention to these wounds is illness down the road in life, and I want to avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, it's in the context of trauma, you're absolutely right. We have this trauma that can take root really early on in life. And we have our 5 senses that take the information from our outside world into our inside world, because our skin, our body is just an interface between what goes on outside and what goes on inside of us, and it's one big super ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And when we can understand that our 5 senses is that connecting element between the outside and the inside, there's 5 feeds that go into our system, and it's a hugely complex system, and our mind is incredibly powerful with all of this, that could be associated with the trauma that you have encoded. So some people who experience a trauma, the smell is encoded as part of it. Some people have physical objects in the periphery can trigger them, but it's not been part of the main visual recording, but the peripheral recording is what can trigger them. And because they're not aware of that peripheral recording, and obviously when you're very young as a child, before you can even talk, your encoding is physical, so how you chose to respond physically and how you chose to respond emotionally before you had the words associated with those emotions. And so all of this gets locked in our system, and then at some point we learn to talk, and often because talking comes quite late on and it wasn't developed at the time that we were there in the context of survival, we don't always connect how we talk and the words that we use. It's harder to connect to the trauma than it is necessarily to use other sensory inputs and outputs that tap much more deeply into it. So, I love that you found somatic experiencing, because it taps into different aspects of your encoding that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily have tapped into just through techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very much a talk therapy. And it may scratch the surface of your encoding, but at the same time, talking about it can be traumatizing in its own right for some people, because talking about it reinforces the traumatic experience that they want to avoid, or they want to release in a different way. So I think, for me, it's really important people find the right therapy or the right coaching approach that suits them, that allows them, like you have, thankfully, to get the release that they need, and to not stop at the first option that presents itself to you if it doesn't work for you.
You know, I've had a lot of experience, Ruth, with talk therapy and somatic experiencing now. And I may be prejudiced by this, but I truly believe that, you know, there are some therapies that are just not suitable for some wounds.
Right.
And I believe talk therapy is probably not the most effective, because, as you say, some traumas are very difficult to talk about. What was fascinating to me in my somatic experiencing was often my wife and I would come to a session, and the first question the practitioner would ask was, "So how's it been for you since our last meeting?" And we felt so safe and so confident in her, but also our own abilities, that we freely talked about things that we might have struggled with in the week prior. Mm-hmm. That represented a starting point, and we always went back to the same practice. Well, where do you feel it? What does it feel like? What does it look like? Slowing it down, and suddenly a memory would pop back into my mind that I'm just not aware or sure that talk therapy would be able to kind of ferret out, you know, that kind of memory. And the beautiful thing for me was, once that memory came into my awareness through that somatic experiencing, where everything is very slowed down, it sort of just dissolves on its own. There's no work to do on it. It comes to you when it comes into your awareness. It's in the process of discharging at that point. And that is the beautiful thing about it. Now, I'll be honest, and excuse my language, the part that sucked for me was there was always more memories to come up to that would come to the surface.
Sure.
No complaints. I would not trade this experience for anything. Mm-hmm. If there are more memories, I'm all for discharging them. And what a beautiful, peaceful way to do it. Mm-hmm. We, over the 4 years we went, I can confidently say that we walked away from our sessions feeling lighter, feeling better, at least 90% of the time. And most importantly, feeling closer to each other. It was like we understood each other better. Marcella understood why I was being triggered. And it's never for the reason we think it is. It's never for whatever triggers us in the moment. There's always something beneath the surface. That's why we talked earlier about, you know, when our body talks to us through our emotions, is trying to get our attention, saying, there's something here for you to pay attention to. There's something here for you to learn. Pay attention to me, learn from me. I've got something to teach you. And until we do that, it just stays kind of locked in our system. So I want to help other vets kind of discover this, because we all want to feel a sense of aliveness in our day-to-day living. We want to have deep connections with the people that are most important to us, and pursue things that are just meaningful and important to us, that give our life meaning. And we want to be more. We want to grow in life. Our triggers can get in the way of that, but they don't have to.
Yeah. And I think it's so important that, you know, given you mentioned the statistics, is how many vets are currently living with unaddressed post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and they haven't received the appropriate treatment. And it can be, I think the key thing, it's very difficult, isn't it, if you've had layers and layers and layers of events, to, like you say, it creeps on you. And I think trauma's like a trauma bucket. Sometimes we can take, sometimes it's just, you know, if we have lots of little traumas, we can deal with it. Sometimes people can't deal with it because their bucket gets tipped over. But eventually, if you're in a calm state, it doesn't. You will eventually have a trauma bucket that's full, and your body can't handle the volume of trauma that you've got stored in your mind. And I think, you know, often, like you mentioned earlier on, is that we're told to hold it in, and we have to be tough and brave, and you know, don't be a crybaby is often the words that get muttered, or you know, don't cry when you're on military parade, you know, if you're doing a remembrance parade and stuff like this. But actually, crying is our natural mechanism for releasing the emotional encoding that we have associated with trauma. It releases the stress hormone cortisol and helps our body downregulate. So it's okay to cry, baby, is what I like to say. And you know, it's so important, isn't it, that we allow ourselves and give ourselves that permission to release it, and acknowledge the fact that just because we might feel tough or be perceived that we have to be tough on the outside, it's okay to take the time for yourself to release the trauma or on the inside that's happened to you as a result of your external environment.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree, Ruth. And I believe that it's not only okay to do that, it's absolutely necessary to do that, because we have to remember there's a cost associated with not crying it out, or doing something to discharge it, right? Doing something to give it expression. And the first step to me in giving it expression is acknowledging it. But once we start denying it, if we become experts at suppressing our emotions, we are absolutely setting ourselves up for illness later on. And so why not just take the easier path? For many people, I think it's a new habit that they need to form. But that's where the strength is. It's very contrary to military culture, as you know, where we're taught you're part of something bigger than yourself. You know, the team depends on you. You know, suck it up and drive on for the sake of the mission. But we have to really be honest with ourselves about where that boundary is for us. And be okay with taking a knee, be okay with discharging that stress that builds up. And as you know, and I just retired from the federal government, from my civilian military job about a month ago. But we're both aware that we work in environments that are very high stress, very, very, very high operational tempo. There's a lot demanded of us, and when we go day in, day out, exerting so much energy and effort for the sake of the mission, but fail to take care of ourselves, it comes at a price that we have to pay eventually.
It's like if you think of your mind as a lovely fertile ground, is when you don't pay attention to it, the weeds start to grow.
Yes.
And or it becomes barren because you're not watering it, and before you know it, it's not nutritious. It's not able to grow plants that need to be grown to keep it beautiful and sustainable. It becomes weak because we have this perception, oh no, you don't need to water the land, it can toughen up itself. And actually by taking that approach, you create a more vulnerable mind. The landscape in your mind becomes much more vulnerable when you don't pay attention to releasing the stressors, that whether it's day-to-day stressors or whether it's releasing yourself from traumas that you've experienced. You create a vulnerable landscape that you didn't need to create. So when you when you do have a major event that happens, or lots of series of little events, your brain reserve has been depleted. We call it brain reserve in the context of your mind, and you're more, like you say, you're more likely to get ill. So at some point your brain reserve is so low that your plants no longer grow in your mind.
No.
And therein you have a barren landscape that's not fit for purpose for anything.
I couldn't agree with you more. Brene Brown talks about vulnerability a lot in her research work, and she's emphatic. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It's the birthplace of innovation and creativity and change. And so, a place that we really need to start to address this topic is with our leadership in our organizations. Yeah. It's an educational matter. I'll just tell you a very quick story that I was in an executive potential program several years ago, and I had to interview senior civilian leadership in the military and flag officers, general officers, as part of that experience. It was a wonderful experience, but this was shortly after my diagnosis, and I just took a chance and got vulnerable and told each one of them, I was just recently diagnosed with PTSD, and I would like to develop a presentation to give to the organization to talk about what I've learned about it. Once I was diagnosed, I had a voracious appetite for learning as much as I could about what was affecting me, and I learned so much. But what I learned through those exchanges was how uninformed people are, even at the highest levels. It's not a criticism of it. We just don't think about it. It's not in the mainstream of our society, and we've got to move it there. And if leaders can start to embrace this idea that trauma is just a wound and it shows up at work as well as at home, and there is a benefit to understanding how it shows up at work, or how we create the conditions in the environment of our professional environment where we work that may exacerbate those symptoms of trauma. Well, maybe we can approach things a little bit differently. And just start that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And we certainly have been pushing this in the UK, is to have those conversations where you can be vulnerable. And in fact, one of the things I did, very similar to yourself, is do a presentation on the trauma of having a miscarriage, because it's it can be part of military life.
Yes, of course.
Because it's part of everyday life.
Yes.
For some people, then they have to go through that process and the pain and the trauma and the grief of having that happen to you. And I think the key thing when you can be vulnerable as a leader is that you demonstrate to people they're not alone, because often you feel super alone. You feel like you're the only one that's suffering. When you create this kind of bubble of invincibility or strength,
yes,
people think that if they're not strong, they're automatically the opposite, or that then everyone else is so strong because everyone's given this facade that I must be the only one that's in this boat. And by being vulnerable and being open and honest about who you are, you demonstrate to people they can be open and honest about who they are, providing you create, like you say, that safe space for people to be allowed to do that without judgment. And I think that's one of the things that is really important in the context of addressing past culture to creating a positive new culture going forward in whatever workplace it is creating that safe haven to allow people to be vulnerable, and for there not to be a consequence of doing so that's going to negatively impact them.
Yeah, beautifully said. I agree completely. And where I think the opportunity is just in that, if we can learn to talk about it, I think that's a pathway toward becoming an even stronger organization, a more effective organization, because as long as we allow ourselves to ignore the presence of this problem, and it is everywhere, I guarantee it is everywhere, then we may appear to be, take a military organization, we may appear to be strong and ready and fit to fight on the surface, but if we're a bunch of wounded people underneath the surface, how effective are we really going to be if we're called to really soldier up? You know, whereas if we figured out a way to allow some vulnerability to play a role here, and to create a safe space, and to recognize without judgment, there are people here that are wounded and they're getting treatment and they're going to be okay, and we support them. Because at the end of the day, I think all of us want to be understood, valued, respected, and appreciated, and wounds and all. And if we support each other that way, I think there's much less to fear here than we make ourselves believe sometimes. So we really have an opportunity. We need some strong leaders to step up and take the lead here.
Yeah. And I think, you know, you hit it there with the context of being that you're wounded is historically, and possibly also in today's society, is if you have a psychological wound, you're seen not wounded, but you can be seen by some as broken. And when you're seen as broken in that context, they might consider you're not fixable.
That's
but
right.
actually wounds can heal if you get the right treatment that's right for you, depending on your wound type. You know, you're not going to go to a heart surgeon if you've got a broken leg, because that's not their specialty.
No.
So it's finding the right person to heal the wound that you have with the appropriate dressing and the appropriate care, because the dressing is only to protect you from healing yourself. So all the wounds, physical wounds we have, we heal ourselves from those. Our body does the work to heal.
Yes.
And we're incredibly capable of doing that. And we are incredibly capable of doing it in our mind as well. And I know we could talk for hours, but I haven't even asked you the first question, which is, what does optimal brain health mean for you personally in the context of your journey?
Well, thank you for that. And let me just say to your last point there, isn't that what resilience is really all about? Our bodies are so capable of healing. But if we create an environment at home and at work and in our social circles that promotes that vulnerability and that resilience, all the better for all of us. In answering your first question, I have lived for a long time with this battle raging in my head, and it's just a lot of talk that goes on and on and on. And so peace from that would be an enormous step toward better brain health. And I'm confident that there are plenty of listeners out there that can relate to this war that's raging in our minds, this conversation that's going back and forth and back and forth, and it just doesn't stop. And we'd love it affects our sleep, it affects our quality of sleep, it affects our day. It informs a lot of our actions. It doesn't mean we're crazy. It just means that there's a lot of noise in our brain. And so finding peace from that is a huge step toward optimal brain health, from my point of view.
Yeah. And I just want to reflect on that, actually, because a lot of the chatter that we have in our mind, this constant thinking and, lots of thoughts, happens in our basal ganglia, which is our anxiety centers. And that's also the reason that's also the center of our brain where we get tics. So when we have a lot of chatter, it's an overactive basal ganglia, overactive anxiety centers in our brain. And where we get tics or bruxism or something like that, which I've had people who've had bruxism from traumatic experience, it's because of that overactivity in our mind. And when we can calm it down, we can eliminate some of the physical responses that we have as a result of this heightened activity in our mind. And there's an enormous amount of power we have to do that ourselves, with the appropriate interventions. And then obviously we can support it also with appropriate nutrition to calm those overactive centers down, and appropriate supplementation if you can't get the right level of nutrition to create that calming effect that you need. And then obviously intervention wise, with your somatic experiencing, and havening is a great one to calm those areas of your mind down. And there's other techniques out there. EMDR is another example, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And then obviously exercise is really key for people to generate the right neurotransmitters in our mind to create that calming oxytocin and serotonin and so on that calm us down too. So there's so much we can do physically and from an activity perspective and a behavioral perspective, and an engagement with our emotions and engagement with our thoughts and challenging the thoughts that we're having and slowing everything down, that can really calm our mind down. And we can do all of this without necessarily having to have any drug intervention, which doesn't always address the root cause of the problem in the first place.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I myself am opposed to medication, and so I've done everything I can do up to this point to avoid that, and I think successfully so. Every time we talk, Ruth, I learn something new from you, so thank you for that. But you're exactly right. These are simple things that we can do, and I'm glad you mentioned somatic experiencing, because as I was listening to you, I thought, well, that's the effect that somatic experiencing has. When we slow things down, we bring ourselves into the present moment, our mind starts calming down too. And so it's very much a habit that we can develop over time if we practice it consistently.
Yeah. And obviously not to mention meditation as well.
Yes.
Which is really about slowing everything down too.
Yes.
And there's loads of different types of meditation that you can use. And again, meditation is a whole field in its own right, is finding the right meditative practice, and hypnotherapy is another one that works for you personally, because they all of these ones, Reiki, and there's energy techniques that look at the energy across your body that can really help you release the trauma that's encoded in your body and also in your mind. I'd love to dive in now into the 5 pillars just briefly, because I know we've talked a lot about chatter and we've talked a lot about emotions. So obviously the fun facts is just a breakout is to look at the 5 pillars of brain health, where F is for feelings, A is for actions, C is connections to ourselves and others, T is the thoughts that we're listening to, and S is our surroundings. So first start with feelings. What's the funniest or most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you?
Well, the memory that comes into mind was when I was stationed just north of London in a place called Molesworth in Cambridgeshire. This was in 1999 during the war in Kosovo. I was sent there on a mission for the organization I worked for. I took 2 sailors with me and about anywhere between 20 and 30 Pelican cases of communications equipment. We flew on British Airways from London to Athens. I had full intent of renting a car big enough to carry those cases and those 2 sailors and me up to Macedonia, where we would do our work, and landed in Athens to find out it was a national holiday in Greece. So I rented a tour bus instead.
Brilliant.
And, we had to stop at an ATM from time to time to keep paying the guy to take us all the way up to he couldn't believe he was taking us to the war front, but there we were. That was good fun.
A coach to the war front. Oh my goodness.
Yes, we got an A for ingenuity there.
What's going into actions as this dips into our behaviors and what we do, but what's the most exciting thing you've ever done?
Well, military career provides you all sorts of opportunity to do exciting things. Um, I went to air assault school late in my career, so rappelling out of a helicopter is definitely right up there. Going on a lot of airborne missions as well with the special operations unit I was assigned to was good fun. I completed a half Ironman about 5 years ago.
Wow.
That was amazing. That was a wonderful experience. And when I was stationed in Hawaii, they have lots and lots of. I got into triathlon there, and I ran and I cycled around the island of Oahu. It's about 133 miles around the circumference. And
wow.
did it both individually, both time running and cycling, and as a relay once. So that was good fun.
Yeah, and I've not done an Ironman, but I've had a friend who's done it actually in Hawaii herself, Val, if she's listening. And that's a really mean feat to do that. It's incredibly, doing a triathlon is incredibly intensive in its own right, never mind attempting a half Ironman.
Yes, perfect for a soldier.
Tapping into thoughts now before we dive back into the conversation is what's the what stupid or crazy thought have you told yourself in the past that isn't true?
Yeah. I could go deep into generational pain here. That's another entirely different conversation. But, we get a little bit into our personal narratives here, I think, which everybody has. And most of them aren't true. They're handed down to us. So the one that got me all the time was not feeling like I'm good enough. And as I reflect back on my life and my upbringing, my relationship with my parents, being kids in World War II, definitely traumatized by their experiences, but never having been availed treatment for it, I can absolutely see how their beliefs of not being good enough might have been developed there and then passed on to me as a consequence of not getting treatment.
And of course, genetically, so through the field of epigenetics, is they would have had a vulnerable mind. And I often see this in my clients and their children. The adult clients have a vulnerable mind. The children tend to have one too.
Yeah.
They have a very similar brain type, or they have a combination of their parents' brain types. And if there's past generational trauma, it does seem to map across into the children, but it will only map in totality if you are triggered. So our genes get turned on or off depending on the environment that we are in. So our surroundings is the fifth pillar. And if our environment turns that particular gene on, then we'll have that encoding expressed as a child. So it's highly likely that has carried across into you. So before you were even born, you would have had a vulnerable landscape in your mind because of your parents' past experiences. But obviously, if the key thing here, as with anything, is providing we are able to turn the gene off that was turned on by not activating it in the environment by the environmental triggers, so we're not triggering that genetic encoding, we can remove it going forward. But it could take 1, 2, 3, however many generations to remove it, depending on the environment the next generation is exposed to. So obviously for yourself, your exposure to a war environment, which you may have been drawn to because of your encoding and everything else, and the family experiences, and I personally was for the need to give back because of the experiences my family had in the Second World War, actually made you more vulnerable, because you put yourself back in the environment that the brain was vulnerable in the first place.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex topic. I will say my Army experience gave me a lot of self-confidence. The military was just an amazing environment for me to be in terms of the opportunity it gives you to really develop yourself into whoever you want to be. It's really an environment that you get out of it what you put into it.
Yeah.
On the one hand. On the other hand, sometimes you're exposed to things, as I was in my career, and you may have been in yours, and other, you just interviewed someone a few weeks ago, I think.
Liz McConaughey.
Yes, absolutely, who had tremendous experiences in Afghanistan. So it seems like a kind of a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
The military is a great environment to boost your self-confidence, but there's a risk, a susceptibility to exposing yourself to other types of experiences that are not healthy for you. And I just want to be clear that there's no blame here for my parents. I think the idea of generational pain taught me not to blame my parents, because they were wounded. They were wounded when I was born, but not only from their war experiences, but by the generations that preceded them.
Of course.
And people that get triggered often tend to blame someone else for the way they're feeling. And that is the surest way of giving our power away. But there are definitely ways to get that back. Yeah,
absolutely agree. And where, in the context of your trauma, do you, and I know you talked about it from your relationship with your parents, do you think that's where it started? When we talk about the trauma tree, it takes root at some point in your life. Do you think it was from your childhood experiences that it first was initiated, or do you think it is back into the experiences of your parents themselves?
Oh, I definitely believe that at least some of it was handed down to me based on my parents' experiences. My mother was a child in a Japanese concentration camp growing up, and my father was a boy in Holland growing up in a town that was occupied by the Germans. He saw some horrible things. We've had members of our family executed, and so those wounds, and tens of millions of people, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, in Asia, were affected by this and never got treatment. Yeah. So there was never an outlet for it. There was never a healing of the wound from that generation. It had to go somewhere. And doesn't it make sense that, at least it does to me, that people from that generation would pass it along, not willingly, but as a consequence of not getting treatment, to the next generation. And it keeps going that way until somebody says no more and starts doing the work to put a stop to it.
I completely agree, and I think I love the fact that you are doing the work and seeking to put a stop to it, to help others really move forward in a positive trajectory in their life, where they are lighter and freer. They're not carrying the burdens from their past. They've not got a rucksack full of rocks. Of lots of little traumas, or an enormous rock with big ones that's weighing them down on their journey into the future. And it's knowing how to lighten that load and have that free spirit again, so that you can go off and do what you want to do without the burden that you may be carrying. Jon Paul, it's been an amazing. It's been such an amazing,
It's been an hour already.
Conversation. We're coming up to the hour, but I don't want to go. But we've talked a lot about trauma and the military stigma that is preventing people from asking for help early. What do you think really needs to change? What would you say the key steps are that need to change to help people, whether that's from a personal perspective or a leadership perspective? We can go either way, you can pick both. What needs to change going forward to make the treatment and the healing of the wound available to those that really need it, so that they can perform effectively on the battlefield when the time comes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Ruth. And I think we've hit on some of the elements of a solution throughout our talk here today. At least in America, still 18 to 22 veterans commit suicide every day here in this country.
Wow.
That's in 10 days, that's a company size element in a military organization. Wow. That's people who do it. There have to be many times that number that are thinking about it, but aren't quite there, or just don't do it. And so there are a lot of people that are suffering out there, and many of them believe it's a life sentence and there's nothing we can do about it. So we've got to talk about this more and bring it into the light. Education is key. At least when I was on active duty, there was no training provided to the forces on what traumatic stress is, what the symptoms look like, how to spot it, and what to do, what you can do about it. I think a lot of work has been done, especially since Iraq and Afghanistan, in bringing it into the light. There's a wonderful organization here, the National Center for PTSD, under the Veterans Administration, that are doing a tremendous amount of work. I know in the UK too, you have an equivalent there that's doing tremendously valuable work, but it's not in the mainstream yet. And it's going to take some leadership and some dedicated effort to kind of coax it out of the shadows and into the light, so that we can start feeling safe and comfortable about talking with it. I think the worst part about this title, PTSD, is the D. So many people,
I agree.
It's a disorder, and it's not. If we can just think of it as a wound that needs treatment, just like if we break our arm, very, very little difference between the two. I think people feel more comfortable about that. And so I look forward to being part of the conversation and making my contribution. There are a lot of people like yourselves and others that are trying to make a difference out there. And together, I believe that we're trying to do the right thing. And the more we talk about this and keep talking about this, the more people will start to listen. So thank you for doing this. And thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you'll have me back. We have more to talk about.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to have you back. Definitely. It's been so much fun. And I think, I think we'll see where we get to in a year's time with passing on that baton of hope. And there's Wounded Warriors is another organisation stateside. Dr. Mark Gordon does a lot of work on traumatic brain injury and helping people heal from trauma, but he takes a very neuroendocrinology approach by looking at the hormonal imbalances. So there's and obviously the Amen clinics, from the work that I do with them, and there's loads of different avenues stateside that you can go to understand, how your brain is working, that it's your brain that's struggling, which is an organ in your body, and it's getting the right support to treat that organ, and it's not you that is broken, but your brain, and brain can be fixed and healed, like any wound.
And that raises our quality of life. And we've got to take a whole of body approach to this. It's not just our brains, it's our body as well. It's how we show up socially and interact with other people. Because as you know, people with traumatic stress often isolate themselves. They withdraw because they don't feel understood. And that's, heading towards suicidal ideation if we don't do something to stem that tide. It's absolutely doable. And that's why I'm excited to do this work.
I'm really excited. And I'm so pleased we reconnected and we've stayed in touch, because I think there's so much we can do together to really help raise the conversation up to the levels that it needs to be, and to provide people with the appropriate training, education and resources to really get the support they need so they can heal from their wounds.
Let's do this.
Let's do it. Jon, Jon Paul, how can people get hold of you and find out more about what you do? What's the best way for them to connect with you?
Easy to find me on LinkedIn. I think you have my Instagram handle flashing on the bottom of the screen. It's at HPX for Vets, High Performance Experience for Veterans. And you can reach me through email at either of those two places. And I would be delighted to talk with anybody that wants to have a follow-up conversation or talk about coaching or talk about anything we've talked about here a little bit more, be a thrill to work with you.
Yeah, and do make sure that you reach out to JP, because he's such an awesome human being, and he's lived the experience and come through the other side. So he's really that beacon of hope and light of hope for those that feel like they're in the tunnel of darkness, that he'll be able to guide you through and help you find the way out. JP, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I look forward to reconnecting with you soon. If there's anything I can do to support you or those that that need the support, your family or your friends, then please don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Back at you, Ruth. Thank you.
You're welcome. Remember, this show is all about brain health, unchaining your pain. You are not stuck with the brain you have. You have the power to make it better. And Jon Paul de Lange has been here to show you how.